The bishop asked if anyone had a reason to stop the wedding and nobody answered. Nobody ever does. But then the doors opened and a woman walked in wearing flat shoes and a plain dress, and Samuel turned around and froze. Because the woman walking toward him was the woman he had buried 3 years ago. She was alive, she was here. She pulled out a photograph, his face drained of color, and Cynthia in her 2 million naira wedding dress looked at that photograph and her hands began to shake. The bishop's voice was the only sound in the room. And 500 people were sitting so still you would think they had forgotten how to breathe. Because this was not just any wedding, this was the kind of wedding that Lagos only sees once in a long while, the kind where the chandeliers alone cost more than most families earn in a full year. Where the flowers were ordered from outside the country, where the row of black Mercedes and Range Rovers outside stretched so far down the road that traffic had stopped moving completely. And at the front of all of it, standing at the altar in a white and gold caftan that fit him like it was made for no other man on earth, was Samuel Kayode. Billionaire, self-made, the kind of man Lagos talks about at dinner tables and in boardrooms and at pepper soup joints in the same breath, the kind of man who had built something from nothing and made the whole city watch him do it, and today finally, he was telling himself that this was what moving forward looked like, that Cynthia standing behind him in a dress that cost 2 million naira was the right decision, that a man could choose happiness again even after the kind of loss that almost takes everything from you. The bishop adjusted his glasses, looked out at the crowd, and said the words that are said at every wedding, the words nobody ever truly answers. If anyone here knows any reason why these two should not be joined, speak now or forever hold your peace. The hall was quiet. And then the doors at the far end of the room opened. Not with noise, not with drama, they simply opened, and a woman walked in, thin, her dress plain, her shoes flat and worn at the heel, walking the way someone walks when they have already decided that nothing and no one will make them stop. And Samuel heard the murmuring before he turned, heard glasses being set down carefully, heard a woman near the front make a sound that was somewhere between a cry and a question, and he turned. And the world stopped. Because the woman walking toward him was Elizabeth Moyo, the woman he had buried 3 years ago, the woman whose funeral he had paid for, whose grave he had stood over alone in the rain long after. Everyone else went home, whose memory had sat on his chest every single morning for 1,094 days like a stone he did not know how to lift. She was alive. She was here. She was walking toward him. And Samuel Kayode, a man who had never once shown weakness in any boardroom or negotiation or storm that life had thrown at him, felt his knees go soft underneath him, and he did not shout. He did not move, he simply stood there completely still, staring at a woman who was not supposed to exist anymore, and 2 security officers stepped forward quickly. Broad men with serious eyes, already moving toward her, and Samuel raised one hand and one word left his mouth, quiet and final. Stop. The officers froze, the entire hall froze, 500 people stopped breathing at exactly the same moment, and Elizabeth kept walking until she was close enough for him to see the tiredness in her eyes and the set of her jaw and the thick envelope she was holding against her chest like it was the most important thing in that room. Because it was. She reached into that envelope, she pulled out a single photograph, she held it up across the distance between them, and his face which had already gone pale drained of every last drop of color, because what was in that photograph should not have existed. It was proof of something that was never meant to see the light, something that would not just stop this wedding but would bring down everyone in that room who had helped make it happen. And Cynthia, standing 3 feet away in her 2 million naira dress, holding her bouquet of white roses, the picture of a perfect Lagos bride. She looked at that photograph, and her hands began to shake. Now you want to know what was in that photograph, and you want to know how Elizabeth Moyo is standing in a Victoria Island wedding hall 3 years after everyone watched her get buried, and we are going to tell you everything, but first tell us where you are watching from right now. Drop your city in the comments because this story has found people in places we never expected, and whether you are in Lagos or London or Accra or Houston or Johannesburg, we want to know you are here. And if you are not subscribed yet, press that button now because what is coming next is the story behind the story, the part that will make you understand exactly what was stolen and exactly what it cost, and we are just getting started. Before we tell you what was in that photograph, we need to take you somewhere first. Not to Victoria Island, not to that wedding hall with the Italian chandeliers and the 2 million naira dress. We need to take you somewhere much older than all of that. Somewhere that shaped everything that happened in that hall. We need to take you to Ajigunle. Now, if you have never been to Ajigunle, people will tell you it is a hard place, and in some ways they are right, but what those people never tell you is that hard places raise strong people, because in Ajigunle there is life. Real life, the kind you can smell and hear and feel, the pepper soup that drifts from a woman's pot at 6 in the morning before the sun has fully decided to show itself, the children playing football in the road with a plastic bottle they tied together because nobody could afford the real thing, the man fixing generators by the roadside singing to himself like he has no care in the world, and there is dignity in Ajigunle, there always was, and Samuel Kayode grew up on one of those streets. His father died when Samuel was 9 years old, and there was no dramatic moment, no big scene, just a boy sitting outside Lagos Island General Hospital on a plastic chair watching nurses walk in and out and slowly understanding from the silence that nobody was coming to tell him good news anymore. And he did not cry. He reached into his pocket and counted the coins he had, 17 naira. He counted them twice. Because even at 9 years old, Samuel Kayode's mind went straight to what was practical, what was next, what could be done with what little remained, and that was who he was, that was always who he was. Elizabeth Moyo lived 4 streets away, and she was not his love story first, she was something more important than that. She was the kind of friend who shows up, the kind who notices without being told, and when Samuel came to school 3 days in a row with nothing in his lunchbox, she never said a word about it. She simply broke her food in half and placed it in front of him like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Like of course she was going to do this, like there was no other option she had ever considered. By their 20s, Samuel had an idea that was eating him alive. A logistics company that would fix how goods moved across Lagos, badly routed trucks. Missed deliveries, wasted money. He had watched it for years and he could see exactly how to make it work. He had filled 3 notebooks with plans so detailed they covered every possible problem. And what he did not have was 50,000 naira for the registration fees. So he told Elizabeth about it one evening sitting outside her mother's house, and she listened to every word without interrupting, and then she said, "Go and prepare your documents. I will sort the money." 3 days later she arrived with an envelope and said nothing more about it. Samuel was too grateful and too excited to ask questions. He took that money and he built, and the company grew, and then it grew again. And it became something even he had not fully imagined, and it was 2 years later when the first big government contract came through and Samuel was finally breathing properly that he found out the truth about where that 50,000 naira had come from. Elizabeth had sold her mother's gold earrings, the ones her mother wore on her wedding day, the only thing of real value the Moyo family had ever owned, gone. Turned into registration fees and handed over without a single word about the sacrifice. And when Samuel confronted her about it, she waved her hand like he was making too much noise over something small. The company kept growing, and through all of it Elizabeth stayed in the background. No title she demanded, no credit she chased. The staff welfare fund was her idea. The policy to hire workers from their own neighborhood was her suggestion, made over jollof rice one evening like it was obvious, like of course they should do this, like there was no other way to run a company that came from where they came from. The last normal night they spent together was at a small restaurant in Surulere, and Samuel told her, "When I build the big office in Ikoyi, your name is going on the door," and Elizabeth laughed the way she always laughed, with her whole face, and she said, "Just make sure the workers are treated well, that is enough for me." 3 weeks later at 2 in the morning Samuel's phone rang. A police officer on the other end, Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, a vehicle off the road, burnt beyond recognition, an ID found in the wreckage. Elizabeth Moyo. And Samuel dropped to the floor of his bedroom right where he was standing. He did not make it to a chair. He sat on that floor and held the phone long after the officer had stopped talking. But here is the thing that nobody stopped to ask that night, the detail that everyone missed, the question that should have changed everything. Elizabeth Moyo never drove on that expressway. She had been afraid of night driving since she was a teenager, something that happened to a neighbor's family when she was young. She always took the bus, always, and her car had not moved from outside her house in 3 months. So what was her ID doing inside a burnt vehicle on a road she never used? Nobody asked. Samuel never thought to question it. And that one missing question, the question nobody asked on that night 3 years ago, is the reason a dead woman walked into a Lagos wedding hall and held up a photograph that stopped everything. So stay close, because the answer to all of it is coming. And wherever you are watching from, drop your city in the comments right now. Lagos, London, Accra, Houston, Nairobi, wherever this story has found you today, we want to know. And if you are not subscribed yet, press that button, because what comes next will show you exactly who decided that a woman like Elizabeth was a problem that needed to go away. And once you hear it, you will understand why this story could only end one way. Now you know who Samuel is and you know who Elizabeth is, so now we need to talk about Cynthia, because every story like this one has someone who looked at something good and decided to take it. And Cynthia Balogun was not the kind of person who acted without a plan. She was 31 with an MBA from Manchester and a mind that understood how companies worked, not just on the surface but deep in the bones, where the weak points lived, where the doors that looked locked could be opened if you knew exactly how to push. 3 years before that wedding, she was in the back of a black Mercedes on 3rd Mainland Bridge reading a financial report about Kayode logistics. Not because she admired Samuel, but because her father had a problem and she was looking at the solution. Chief Balogun had spent 30 years building political influence in Lagos. He knew which government contracts moved before any public announcement. He knew ministers and commissioners and men whose names never appeared in newspapers but whose decisions shaped everything. But his old channels were becoming too closely watched, and Kayode Logistics was growing fast and looked clean on every surface, which made it exactly what he needed. The only obstacle was Elizabeth Moyo, not a board member, not an executive, just someone Samuel had grown up with, working quietly with no title and no profile. But Chief Balogun's people had watched long enough to know that Samuel trusted nobody the way he trusted her, and she would see through everything before the plan had even begun. So one evening Chief Balogun called his daughter into his study, placed Elizabeth's file on the desk, and said, "The woman has to go," and he said it the way someone cancels a meeting. No anger, no drama, just a conclusion reached after looking at the facts, and Cynthia thought through every option. A scandal, a smear, something that would push Elizabeth out naturally, and by midnight she had her answer. None of it would work. Elizabeth was too clean, too trusted, too woven into everything Samuel believed. So she called her father and said, "Proceed." 2 weeks later the accident happened, and the morning after, while Samuel was still on the floor of his bedroom, Cynthia arrived at his door with food and condolences and a patience she was prepared to hold for as long as necessary. But what Cynthia did not know, what she would not discover until it was far too late, was that on the night of that accident a woman named Mama Chidinma was sitting by the expressway on a wooden stool with a kerosene lamp and a tray of groundnuts, selling to truck drivers the way she had done for 11 years, and she saw everything that happened on that road, not part of it, all of it, and she kept quiet because nobody came to ask her, until one afternoon a thin woman walked up to her stall and asked in a quiet voice, "Auntie, do you remember that night on the expressway?" And wherever you are watching from, drop your city in the comments. Lagos, London, Accra, Nairobi, Toronto, we want to know you are here. And if you are not subscribed, press that button now, because what Mama Chidinma saw that night is about to change everything. Here is what the official police report said. Single vehicle accident, Lagos Ibadan Expressway, vehicle left the road at high speed, caught fire on impact. Victim identified through dental records, death confirmed, case closed. And here is what the report left out: everything that actually happened. Mama Chidinma had been selling groundnuts by that road for 11 years, and she knew every sound that stretch of expressway made at night, the long distance trucks, the Danfo drivers pushing too fast, the silence between vehicles that meant something was coming. And that night she heard two sounds, not one, first the tires losing the road, then the deep knock of a vehicle leaving it completely, and she stood and looked. The car had gone into the bush and it was already burning, But that was not the thing that stopped her breathing. It was the second vehicle. A dark black Range Rover ED parked behind the crash and men climbed out, but they did not run toward the fire the way people run when they want to help. They moved slowly and deliberately the way people move when they are checking that a job has been done correctly. They looked at something in the bush beside the road, got back in, and drove away before any siren, before any other car had stopped, before anyone official arrived. Mama Chidinma looked at that bush and saw a woman lying in the grass, still but breathing, thrown from the vehicle before the fire reached her, and Mama Chidinma had no phone, so she stepped into the road and waved her kerosene lamp at the next headlights coming through. A Dango truck driver stopped, and together they carried the woman to a small clinic in Sagamu without waiting for anyone official, because they understood that waiting might mean losing her. The clinic had 2 rooms and equipment that barely worked, but it had Dr. Adiz Nwosu, 26 years old, 3 months into her NYSC posting, and she worked through the entire night and the woman lived. But when she opened her eyes 4 days later, she did not know who she was, no name, no memory, no ID, and the clinic wrote Jane, Expressway accident, Sagamu. Memory came back slowly, not in pictures but in feelings, the warmth of a hand breaking food in half. A boy counting coins in a hospital corridor, gold earrings pressed into a palm, and one morning. She picked up an old newspaper from the clinic waiting room, turned pages without purpose, and stopped at page 7, a man cutting a ribbon at a logistics depot in Ibadan. She did not know the name in the caption, but she knew that face, and she sat in that plastic chair and cried for 20 minutes without understanding why. 3 weeks later her full memory returned, all of it, in one night, and the first thing that came back sharper than everything else was not Samuel's face but Cynthia's voice on a phone call Elizabeth had overheard 2 weeks before the accident. Words she had not understood at the time but understood completely now, and she pressed both hands flat against the mattress to steady herself, because she could not go back to Samuel yet, not before she was ready. Because if Cynthia discovered she was alive before Elizabeth had everything she needed, the next attempt would not leave her breathing in a bush beside a road. And wherever you are watching from, drop your city in the comments right now. And if you are not subscribed, press that button, because what Elizabeth does next, alone, with nothing, is the part of this story nobody saw coming. She left the clinic with nothing, no bag, no phone, no money, just the clothes on her back and a folded newspaper photograph. And Dr. Adiz pressed 5,000 naira into her palm at the door and said, for transport, come back and tell me your name when you find it, and Elizabeth did not look back. She did not go to Lagos, because the people who tried to kill her still lived there, still moved freely, still believed they had won. So she went to Ibadan instead, found a single room in Bodija with one window and a mattress and a fan that worked 3 days out of 7. Found work at a small pharmacy under a name that was not hers, ate one proper meal a day and saved everything else. Every kobo had a purpose now, and she did not rush, because rushing was how people made mistakes, and for her a mistake would not mean embarrassment, it would mean a second attempt that finished the job. She built her case the same way she once helped build Samuel's company, slowly, without noise, without drawing any eye toward what she was doing. And her first lead was the mortuary official whose signature sat on her death certificate. She tracked him through 2 weeks of careful watching and one phone call from a roadside business center paid for in cash. She never approached him. She watched him, and within 2 weeks she confirmed that Chief Balogun was paying him monthly silence money, every single month. Then she found Mama Chidinma, and the old woman saw her walking toward the groundnut stall and covered her mouth with both hands and could not speak for almost a full minute. And when she finally could, she told Elizabeth everything: the second vehicle, the men who pulled her from the car before setting it alight, the careful, unhurried way they moved, and she said, I kept quiet because I was afraid and nobody came to ask, but I prayed for you every night, my daughter, every single night, and Elizabeth recorded every word. What she uncovered next was bigger than she had imagined, because this was never only about removing her. After the wedding, Cynthia planned to gain full signing authority over Samuel's company, route government contracts through Chief Balogun's network, and move company assets into shell companies registered in her own name. Samuel was simply meant to love her, trust her, and sign whatever she placed before him. Then one evening Elizabeth opened This Day and found it on page 9. Lagos billionaire Samuel Kayode set to wed Chief Balogun's daughter, Victoria Island, date confirmed, and she read it twice, counted everything in her file one more time, decided it was enough. Made one phone call to an EFCC contact with no name given, just account numbers and transaction dates and a time and a location, then booked a small room in Surulere for the night before the wedding. She was going through her documents one last time when the knock came, a hotel staff member, an envelope, no sender name, and inside was one handwritten note: "We know you are alive, come to that wedding and you will not leave Lagos." And she read it once, folded it, placed it in her file, picked up her evidence, straightened her dress and walked out into the night, because there was never a version of this where she stayed silent. And drop your city in the comments right now. Lagos, London, Accra, Houston, Nairobi, wherever this story found you, and if you are not subscribed, press that button, because tomorrow she walks into that hall and now you know exactly what she is carrying when she does. We left you at the photograph and now we tell you what was inside it. 3 people sitting around a table, Cynthia on the left, Chief Balogun on the right, and in the middle Dr. Fashola, the mortuary official from Lagos Island whose signature appeared on Elizabeth's death certificate. The same man whose job it was to confirm that the burnt body on that expressway was Elizabeth Moyo. 3 people who should never have been in the same room together. And a private investigator Elizabeth hired 3 months ago had taken it through a restaurant window in Victoria Island. Paid for with money saved across 2 years of eating 1 meal a day. Samuel stared at it and his mind would not move, because 6 months ago in a quiet moment of suspicion he had asked Cynthia directly if she knew Dr. Fashola, showed her the name, and she looked him in the eye without hesitation and said, "I have never met that man in my life," and he had believed her, and now the hall was completely silent until his voice came through it, not a shout, the kind of quiet that is more frightening than noise, and he said, "Cynthia, who is the man in this photograph?" And it was not a question. She had a response ready for almost anything, but she had not planned for Elizabeth being alive, and she looked at the crowd, not at Samuel, and said, "That woman has been through something terrible and she has come to destroy what we have built. Do not let her do this to us." And she held that composure for 4 seconds before something behind her eyes shifted, because Elizabeth was not reacting, not defending herself. She was simply opening her envelope and placing documents on the nearest table one at a time. Bank transfer records, phone transcripts, Mama Chidinma's recorded account, and at the bottom a signed confession from Dr. Fashola himself, obtained 2 weeks earlier when Elizabeth sat across from him alone and gave him one clear choice. A guest near the front picked up one document, read it, passed it sideways, and within 90 seconds those papers were moving hand to hand across the entire hall, and Chief Balogun stood from the front row and said, "This woman is a fraud. Security, remove her now." But nobody moved, because the security team was watching Samuel, and Samuel was not watching Chief Balogun, he was watching Cynthia, and Cynthia had nothing left. The main doors opened, 2 men in plain clothes walked in, showed their EFCC identification and walked to the front, and Chief Balogun went first. Then Cynthia, still in her wedding dress, bouquet still in her hand, walking out while 500 phones recorded every step. And Samuel stood alone at the altar where he had come to begin a new life. Elizabeth picked up her envelope and turned to leave, and his voice stopped her, just her name. The first time he had spoken it since she walked in, and she turned, and Samuel Kayode dropped to his knees on the floor of that hall, not for the crowd. In the way a person goes down when something becomes too heavy to hold standing up. And he said 4 words I should have known, and Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment and said something nobody in that hall expected. Something that would be replayed on every phone before the night was over, something that changed what everyone thought they understood about why she came. And drop your city in the comments, because that answer is coming, and if you are not subscribed, press that button now before the next one drops. 500 people were waiting for her answer, and Samuel was on his knees and the phones were pointed, and the entire hall was holding the same breath it had held since those doors opened. And Elizabeth looked at this man she had known since they were children with nothing, and she spoke. She said, "Get up, Samuel," not softly, the way you speak to someone you respect too much to watch stay on the floor, and he stood, and she looked at him and said, I did not come back for an apology. I came back because those people were going to take everything you worked for. The drivers, the warehouse staff, the people from our neighborhood that you employ, people with no backup and no safety net. They would have lost everything too, and they did nothing wrong. And then she said, I came back for them. Samuel opened his mouth and closed it because there was nothing he could say that would be enough for what she had just told him. An older woman near the back of the hall began to clap, slowly once, then again, and the person beside her joined, then the row in front, and it moved through that hall the way something moves when it has been waiting to be released, not the sound of celebration but of recognition. The sound people make when they have seen something true and their hands need to say so because words are not fast enough. And Elizabeth did not look at the crowd. She gathered her documents and walked toward the door the way someone leaves when the work is done. Outside she got into a taxi heading back to Surulere, took off her shoes and looked out the window at Lagos passing, Danfo buses, a woman selling plantain by the road, children running through a gap between two buildings, the noise and color of the city she grew up in, and for the first time in 3 years she was not watching over her shoulder, not planning, not hiding. She called Dr. Adiz and said 2 words, "It's done," and the doctor cried on the phone and Elizabeth stayed on the line, and then she called Mama Chidinma, who was quiet for a moment before saying, "I told you, God does not sleep." Back at the hall Samuel thanked 500 guests, announced the cancellation, asked for privacy and meant it. His voice stayed level the entire time and every person watching could see exactly what that steadiness was costing him. And that evening he told his board everything, the fraud, the EFCC, the full plan for his company's assets, and he said, "I allowed closeness to replace judgment and that will not happen again." And an old board member from Ibadan leaned forward and said quietly, "The company is still standing because Elizabeth Moyo remembered who built it," and Samuel had no answer, he just sat with it. 3 days later he drove alone to Bodija and parked outside a small building with a hand-painted sign that read Moyo Women's Foundation, Dignity, Justice, Rise, and through the window he could see her at a whiteboard talking to a group of young women, and then one of them said something and Elizabeth laughed, fully, with her whole face, the first time he had seen her laugh since she came back, and he did not go inside. He sat in that car and looked through that window, and something happened that had not happened to Samuel Kayode across all the years of building and grieving and surviving. So drop your city in the comments. 3 weeks after the wedding that never happened, the front page of Punch carried a photograph that Lagos stopped to look at twice. Chief Balogun, hands behind his back, walking out of an EFCC building in broad daylight, and the headline read, "Lagos Power Broker, Daughter Arrested Over Billionaire Wedding Fraud and Staged Death." And by noon it was the top conversation on Nigerian Twitter, by evening it was on every news channel, and by the next morning people who had sat in that Victoria Island hall were giving interviews about what they witnessed with their own eyes. The charges were not small: conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, corporate manipulation, corruption of public officials. And the EFCC had moved fast because Elizabeth had not given them suspicion, she had given them a roadmap. Account numbers, transaction dates, shell company names registered in Abuja and Port Harcourt, evidence so precise that the legal team had very little to argue before proceedings even began. And Dr. Fashola was arrested at his Lagos Island clinic the same morning. He did not resist. He had known this was coming since Elizabeth sat across from him 3 weeks before the wedding and laid out his 2 choices. But this chapter is not about the arrests, it is about the people who nearly lost something far more important. Baba Remy, 58 years old, warehouse supervisor at the Apapa depot since the day it opened, since Samuel was still driving one of the trucks himself. 2 years from retirement. And under Cynthia's plan his pension account was already marked for redirection into her shell companies, and he did not know that. He only knew he had worked honestly for over a decade and went home to his wife and grandchildren every evening trusting that what he had built was safe. Aisha, 26, a truck driver from Kano, one of the first women Samuel hired when the company expanded north because Elizabeth had told him years ago that the best drivers on that road were women who could not get hired anywhere else. Her salary going to her widowed mother and 3 younger siblings every month, and she only knew her pay had arrived 4 days late 3 weeks before the wedding. The first time in 4 years, a quiet test. Cynthia ran to see how much she could move without anyone noticing. Emeka, 19, a dispatch rider in Enugu working toward a university degree that Samuel's company covered half of through a staff scheme. Elizabeth had argued for one evening until Samuel agreed, and none of these three knew her name, none were at the wedding. But everything she risked walking into that hall was standing between them and ruin. Samuel visited the Apapa depot 1 week after the arrests. No speech, no announcement, just walking the floor quietly with Baba Remy asking questions and listening. And at the end Baba Remy looked at him and said, "Oga Samuel, we heard what happened. That woman who came to the wedding, God used her," and Samuel nodded because there was nothing more he could say. 2 months into the proceedings a sealed letter arrived at his Ikoyi office, handwritten. His assistant placed it on the desk without a word. It was from Cynthia, and Samuel sat alone with it for a long time before opening it, read it once, folded it and placed it in his drawer without showing anyone. And that evening he drove to Ajigunle and sat in his mother's small kitchen while she made ogi on a kerosene stove, said nothing about the letter. Just sat there and let the smallness of that kitchen remind him of everything that still mattered, and what was in that letter will change what you think you know about Cynthia. 6 months after the wedding that never happened, the hand-painted sign above the bodija door had been replaced with proper wood and clean letters, mounted by a man who refused payment because his wife had been one of the foundation's first clients, and the sign read Moyo Women's Foundation. Dignity, justice, rise. A generator hummed outside so the lights held through every nipa cut. A second room had been added at the back, and Elizabeth had built all of this from 5,000 naira and 3 years of eating one meal a day. Her day started at 5:30. She lived 2 streets away, made akra on a small gas cooker, ate while reading through the day's program and walked to work before the street vendors finished setting up. And the work was not the kind that appeared in magazine profiles. It was a market woman whose landlord took her stall illegally while she was in hospital. 3 weeks of guidance ending with a magistrate and a victory. It was a woman navigating the legal system alone to get her children back after leaving a violent home. It was young women from Ajigunle trying for 2 years to access a federal grant that a local official had been redirecting into his own accounts until Elizabeth traced it, documented it and filed the complaint that freed the funds. She had 3 staff members, all women, all from backgrounds close enough to her own that the work needed no long explanation. She paid them every month without fail, and the foundation ran on her savings, small donations, and a quiet monthly transfer from a company account listed simply as KL Foundation Support. And she knew where it came from. She had not called to say thank you and had not called to say stop. She used it for the work and let that be enough. Across the city Samuel was also rebuilding, quietly, without press. He restructured his board, added independent directors and created a formal whistleblower channel inside the company, a direct line from any staff member straight to the board, and he named it internally the Elizabeth Protocol, and only he and his assistant knew why. And he went to his Ajigunle primary school one Tuesday without telling anyone, sat with the headmistress, took her 2-page list of needs, folded it into his pocket, and 3 weeks later a contractor arrived with no press release and no post. One afternoon Dr. Adiz came to the foundation and they sat with 2 cups of zobo and talked for 3 hours. And before she left Dr. Adiz said, "When I worked on you that night I did not think you would make it to morning. I prayed then went back to work because that was all I knew to do." And Elizabeth held her hand across the desk and said, "That was enough, that was everything." And Mama Chidinma came once a month selling groundnuts in the courtyard on Saturdays while women gathered for the legal clinic, a small thing that meant everything to the old woman. On a Thursday evening with the staff gone, Elizabeth stood at her whiteboard writing the 3-year plan, and at the top of the page she wrote, "What we build must outlast us." And then came a knock at the door, past 7. Nobody expected, and she opened it and Samuel was standing outside in plain trousers and a simple shirt, holding nothing, no envelope, no flowers, just a man at a door he had driven past 4 times in 6 months without stopping. And he said, "I know I should have called, but I have spent 6 months searching for the right words and I have finally understood there are no right words. So I am here instead." And Elizabeth held the moment and then stepped back and held the door open. He walked in and looked around slowly at the whiteboard full of writing, at the photographs of women on the wall, at the simple desk and the Zobo flask, and he said, "You built this from nothing," again, and she said, "I had practice," and they sat across from each other. Two people who grew up 4 streets apart in Ajigunal, who once shared food because one of them had none, now in a room built from almost nothing. And Samuel read her the letter word for word because she deserved every word exactly as Cynthia had written it. Cynthia had not asked for forgiveness, she had written 3 things. That from the very first week she understood Elizabeth was the reason Samuel's company had a conscience. That every good decision she could trace led back to Elizabeth's influence. And she wrote, "I told myself I was removing an obstacle. I understand now I was trying to remove a conscience." And the second was that the night before the accident she had called it off. Told her father she wanted another way, and Chief Balogun moved forward without telling her. She found out the next morning when Samuel's phone rang. She said nothing and she wrote, "That silence is what I will carry." And the third was one sentence alone at the bottom, "Tell her I am sorry, not for your sake, for hers." Elizabeth was quiet for a long time and then said she will have to find her own way to live with what she did. "That is not my work." And Samuel nodded and asked the question he actually came for and said, "What do you need, Elizabeth?" "Not from me. Not from anyone. What do you actually need?" And she looked at him directly without performance and said, "I need a proper legal team. I have 3 cases where these women would win with real representation and I cannot keep a lawyer on retainer." And something close to a real smile crossed his face, not because it was funny but because it was the most Elizabeth answer possible. Practical, specific, no drama, and he said, "I will arrange it by end of next week." They talked for 2 hours, not about the wedding, not about the 3 years. They talked about Baba Remy's retirement party which Samuel was quietly funding, about Aisha from Kano just promoted to fleet coordinator, about Emeka in Enugu who passed his second-year examinations and was on course to graduate. 3 people who would never know how close they came to losing everything, still standing because a woman with nothing chose to walk through a door. And when Samuel finally stood to leave he turned back and said, "Your name? I want it on the Ikoyi building the way I promised." And Elizabeth shook her head and said, "Put it on this one instead. This is the building that matters." 1 year later the foundation had expanded to 3 states, over 400 women helped, 11 staff, a waiting list. And on a Tuesday morning Elizabeth arrived at 5:45 as she always did, unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and on her desk was one photograph, not of Samuel, not of any award. 2 children on a broken wall in Ajigunal sharing a plate of rice, 1 boy, 1 girl, both laughing at something the camera did not catch. And beneath it in her handwriting, "We always knew how to build from nothing," and she opened her notebook and began. Chief Balogun received 12 years, Cynthia received 5 reduced for cooperation, the mortuary official lost his license and received 3, and Samuel never remarried. He became one of the most respected voices in Nigeria on staff welfare and business ethics. 1 interview per year, and every single time when asked about the turning point in his leadership he said, "I learned that the most important person in any room is usually the one nobody is paying attention to." And Elizabeth was awarded the Nigerian Women of Integrity Prize 2 years after the foundation launched and did not attend. She sent Dr. Adiz in her place because she was in Kano that week sitting with market women listening to what they needed and writing it down as she always had been. As she always would be. And if this story found you at the right time, share it with someone who needs it. Drop your city in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, the button is right there because you have been here from the beginning and you might as well stay for what comes next. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.